Good morning, and welcome to the homecoming celebration for Butler Island slave descendants. My name is Annette Holmes, and I am a direct descendant of Butler Island slaves John and Betsy. I began my Butler family research in 2004 after the family historian, my Uncle Charles, passed away. I started with my grandmother, Henrietta Butler, who was born in 1902 in Red River Parish, Louisiana. And that's a picture of my grandmother. Love her always. Rest in peace, Henrietta Butler. And I found 8-year-old Henrietta Butler on the 1910 census for Red River Parish with her family, her siblings, and her parents, James and Hannah Butler. From there, I wanted to go back and see if I could find her parents on earlier censuses. So I was able to track her father, James Butler, he was known as Jim, to the 1870 census, which is the first census that African Americans were enumerated in by name. And on that census, James was with his siblings and his parents. His parents were John and Betsy. His siblings, Kate, Violet, John Jr., Abraham, Jack, and Carolyn. And I noticed that his parents, John and Betsy, and his two elder siblings, Kate and Violet, had their birthplace listed as Georgia, and everyone else was born in Louisiana. His sibling Violet, the last one born in Georgia, she was born around 1858, and the next sibling John was born around 1861. So I figured, between 1858 and 1861, the family had moved from Georgia to Louisiana. And so I knew that at one point these folks were slaves from their birth dates. And I said, well, moved really meant sold, because I know they were not free to just walk around wherever they wanted to. And so that kind of piqued my curiosity because I said, well, earlier, a few months earlier, I had watched this program called Africans in America. And on that program, they had a segment about the slaves that were sold from Butler's Island, Georgia. And I said, that's odd. And, it was interesting because the name was Butler. But I said, my family's from Louisiana. And there's no connection there, but it was interesting because they were butlers. And so I started this research on this sale, and it came up, the Weeping Time, and this article came up, and the author of the article started listing or talking about things that happened during the auction between the slaves and different little stories of you know, things that transpired on the auction block. And then he went on to say he was going to list the groupings of the slaves, how they were sold in families. And the first name that he listed was number 99, and it said Kate's John. Kate's John. That's interesting. And the next number, 100, was Betsy. Okay. 101, 6-year-old Kate. Yep. 102, 3-month-old Violet. And I'm at work doing this research. I'm on my lunch hour. And I just sat there and I stared at the screen. I couldn't believe it. And you always knew, you had slaves in the family. But it just doesn't sink in until you see a name and a price. And this was my family being sold for $510 each. And I was blown away. And the tears started rolling. So I did some more research, And, this was known as the weeping time because it rained during the 2 days of the sale, March 2nd and 3rd in 1859. And I learned that my family was sold to someone by the name of Archibald Wells Baird of Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana. So I did all this research. Who was this person that owned my family? And I came across this book by Malcolm Bell titled Major Butler's Legacy, 5 Generations of a Slaveholding Family. And I wanted to know everything I could find out. Who was this person? Where did he come from? What was he all about? And so I learned through this book by Malcolm Bell that Major Butler, was a founding father. He signed the U.S. Constitution for the state of South Carolina, and he was the first representative for the state of South Carolina in Congress. And so, by him being this important person, his records are housed at the University of California at Berkeley. And since Berkeley is right in the neighboring city of where I live, I was able to go over to the Doe Library on campus and sit there on the weekends and just comb through all of these records. And they're meticulous records. They have births and deaths, and we doled out this many pairs of socks and shoes and this much bacon bits, and it was meticulous. And these people were property, and they were listed with chickens, cows, and all the other animals. And that's the way it was. And so I was able to figure out that these slaves were on the Butler plantations were descendants of slaves that were on the Bull plantation. And so the Bull plantation was the plantation of Mary Branford Bull, who was married to John Bull, famous Bull family of South Carolina. These were her slaves in 1770s, and in 1771, her estate was divided amongst her 4 granddaughters. And one of those granddaughters was Mary Middleton of the famous Middleton family, and Mary Middleton was the wife of Major Pierce Butler. So that is how he gained his wealth, his fortune and fame was through his wife. And one of the other granddaughters of Mary Branford Bull was Elizabeth Isaac Blake. And Elizabeth Isaac Blake was the wife of Captain Daniel Blake, another famous South Carolina family. And another granddaughter was a Garrard, Sally Garrard. She was the wife of Governor of South Carolina, Benjamin Garrard. And so my family became slaves of Elizabeth Isaac Blake. And through all of these records, I was able to determine who the parents of Kate's John was. His parents were Hercules and Kate. And so that's why he was called Kate's John, to distinguish him between all the 50 other Johns on the plantation. And Betsy's parents were Violet and Jerry. And this is how the 2 girls got their names. Kate was named after her paternal grandmother, and Violet was named after her maternal grandmother. And so I also was able to learn that Kate's parents were Captain and Dorcas, and that Captain's parents were Nero and Diana, and Dorcas' parents were Jack and Jenny, all slaves on the Bull and Blake plantations. And one of Kate's siblings was the famous Cooper and Methodist preacher known as Cooper London, who in 1820 had a son with his wife Judy, and the son's name was Wallace. And Wallace would go on to marry Jerusalem Blake, who my fellow historian and descendant of Butler Island slaves Tiffany Young, who is there with you all today, she bases her one-woman skit show on Jerusalem Blake, known as Aunt Jerusalem, and she's mentioned in Fanny Kimball's diary as well. So I was able to do all of this research, find out brothers and sisters. I uh, sent off for the catalog, the auction catalog at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, and they sent me all the names and all the prices of all the slaves sold at the auction in March 1859. And I also was able to find records of all the slaves that were not sold. And so the slaves that were sold were the property of Major Butler's grandson, Pierce Mace Butler, who had to sell his slaves to pay out some debt that he had incurred. But the slaves that were inherited by Pierce Mace Butler, John Butler, Captain John Butler, another grandson of Major Butler, he was deceased at the time, so his slaves could not be sold by Pierce Butler, and they were allowed to stay. Those slaves became the property of John Butler's widow, Gabriella Manigault Morris Butler. So I have all of those names and their ages, and I was able to track both groups of families. I tracked the slaves from 1771. I tracked the slaves that made it to Nova Scotia with the British in 1815. I tracked some of those families to Hammond's Plain, Nova Scotia. One of the families there moved to Trinidad because they could not stand the conditions they were subjected to in Nova Scotia. I tracked the families that were sold, families that were allowed to stay. I found on the census records, Freeman's Bank records, death records, birth records, to 1930 and beyond. If I could link a name to another name, that's how I did it. I connected the dots. And so what my research is leading me to now is to track all the descendants of those families that were once enslaved on the Butler plantations and connect those dots, because we're basically all related and we just don't know how. And so I want to connect the dots, and I want to share the story of our family's lives, and because I think it's a story worth sharing, and I think it's a story worth telling. And so if any of you are interested in the research, you can contact me at annette.holmes@ucop.edu, and I will be happy to share all of my findings. So I hope you all have a good time today, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.